The air inside the grand ballroom was thick with expensive perfume and the sharp smell of polished leather. It was the kind of place where people didn't just walk, they glided, believing that the ground should be grateful for their footsteps. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, casting a bright, almost blinding light over the hundreds of round tables below. At every table, people dressed in heavy silk and dark suits sat eating tiny portions of food that took more time to decorate than to eat. Laughter bubbled up from every corner, but it wasn't the warm kind of laughter shared between friends. It was a loud, practiced sound, used to show off wealth and importance. In the middle of all this noise and shine, a young woman moved quietly. Her name was not important to the people in the room. To them, she didn't have a name. She was just the waitress. She wore the standard black uniform that was slightly too tight around the shoulders and shoes that pinched her toes after standing for 6 hours straight. Her hair was pulled back severely, exposing a face that was pretty but tired. Her eyes, however, were the most striking part of her. They were dark and observant, taking in everything but saying nothing. She walked through the narrow paths between the tables, holding a heavy silver tray high above her shoulder. On the tray sat crystal glasses filled with champagne that cost more than she earned in a week. She moved like a ghost, careful not to disturb the important conversations happening around her. If she accidentally made a sound, the diners would look at her not with anger, but with a cold, blank stare, as if she were a piece of furniture that had suddenly squeaked. "More water, please," a man in a tuxedo said without even turning his head. He didn't say please as a kindness, he said it like a command. The waitress set her tray down on a side table and picked up a pitcher. She moved to his table and poured the water smoothly, her wrist steady despite her tiredness. "Is the bottle cold?" he asked, finally glancing at her. "It feels warm." "It is chilled, sir," she said softly. "The glass is warm from your hand." The man frowned, looking at the glass as if it had personally offended him, then waved his hand dismissively. "Just go. Get the waiter." She didn't argue. She didn't roll her eyes. She simply lowered her head, whispered, "Yes, sir," and walked away. She had learned a long time ago that in this world, her voice didn't carry weight. Her only purpose was to serve, to refill, to clear, and to disappear. As she moved through the crowd, she passed a group of women dripping in diamonds. They were laughing loudly about a trip they had taken to an island she couldn't pronounce. One of them gestured wildly, her elbow knocking into the waitress's tray. The glass wobbled but didn't fall. The waitress caught it just in time, her heart hammering against her ribs for a second. The woman didn't apologize, she didn't even notice. She just kept talking about the sand and the sun. The waitress let out a breath she didn't know she was holding and kept moving. Her feet hurt, throbbing in a rhythm with the low jazz music playing in the background. It was a live band playing in the corner, 3 men in suits playing smooth, boring music that was meant to be ignored. It was safe background noise, the kind of sound that rich people liked to hear while they spent money. It had no soul, no fire. It just existed. She brought her tray back to the service station, a small area hidden behind a large fake plant. It was the only place where she could rest for a moment. She leaned against the wall and rubbed her hands together. Her fingers were rough from years of work. But under the roughness, if you looked closely, there were hard calluses on the tips of her fingers, specifically on the thumb, index, and middle finger of her right hand, and the thumb, index, middle, and ring finger of her left hand. They weren't calluses from holding trays or scrubbing floors. They were the marks of a pianist. She looked out toward the main floor again. Her eyes drifted past the glittering guests, past the boring band, and landed on the grand piano sitting alone on a small stage near the front of the room. It was a magnificent instrument, black and shiny, reflecting the lights of the chandeliers. It had been silent all night, serving only as a decoration, a prop for the photographers to capture in the background of their photos. She felt a pull in her chest, a sharp ache that had nothing to do with hunger or physical pain. She remembered the feel of piano keys under her fingers, the resistance, the weight, the magic. She remembered how she could press a key and make a room go silent. She remembered how music used to be her language, the only way she could truly speak. But that felt like a lifetime ago. That was before the bills piled up, before her father got sick, before she had to sell her own keyboard to pay for rent. Now, her music was trapped inside her, swirling around in her head with nowhere to go. She hummed a few bars of a melody under her breath, a complex, haunting tune she had been working on in her mind for months. It was the only thing keeping her sane during these long, endless nights of serving people who didn't see her. "Hey, you," a sharp voice cut through her thoughts. It was the manager, a man with a sweaty forehead and a tight suit. He was rushing around with a clipboard, looking stressed. "Yes," she asked, straightening up instantly. "Why are these tables not cleared?" he snapped, pointing a pen at a section across the room. "Table 12 has been empty for 10 minutes. Do you think the maids are going to do it move?" "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm going now." She grabbed a tub for dirty dishes and hurried out from behind the plant. As she walked toward table 12, she had to pass right by the grand piano. It was closer than usual, separated from the guests by only a small velvet rope. She slowed down for just a second. The polished wood of the piano gleamed under the lights. It looked so inviting, so alive compared to the plastic, fake smiles of the party. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to reach out and touch it. Just one touch. To feel the connection, to remind herself that it was real. Her hand moved slightly away from the dirty dish tub, her fingers stretching out toward the glossy surface. "Watch where you're going," a man shouted as he brushed past her, bumping her shoulder hard. She stumbled back, barely catching herself. She quickly pulled her hand back, hiding it in the folds of her apron. The man didn't even look back. He was too busy talking on his phone, shouting at someone on the other end of the line about a stock market crash. The waitress felt her face flush with embarrassment. She looked around, terrified that someone had seen her almost touching the instrument. But no one was looking at her. They were all looking at their plates, their phones, or each other. She was invisible. She was nothing. She lowered her head, hiding the tears that were stinging the corners of her eyes, and continued walking toward the dirty table. She picked up the half-empty glasses and the crumpled napkins, scraping the leftover food into the bin. The sound of scraping silverware against china was harsh and ugly, a perfect match for how she felt inside. Across the room, the boring jazz band started a new song. It was a slow, dragging tune that made the air feel even heavier. The waitress closed her eyes for a split second and let her own melody play in her head again. It was fast and powerful, full of sharp notes and deep chords. It was a sound that could break through this heavy air, a sound that could make these people stop eating and start listening. But then she opened her eyes, and the moment was gone. She was just holding a tub of dirty dishes. She was just the waitress. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, her shoes squeaking softly on the marble floor. Behind her, the party continued. The champagne kept flowing, the laughter kept echoing, and the grand piano sat silently in the corner, waiting for someone who knew how to wake it up. The clock on the wall seemed to be moving slower than usual. It was that strange time of the night, just past 10, where the energy in a big event either spikes up or crashes down completely. In the Chandelier Hotel ballroom, the energy was taking a nosedive. The initial excitement of seeing and being seen had worn off. The expensive food had been eaten, the champagne bottles were mostly empty, and the loud, bragging conversations were starting to repeat themselves. The young waitress moved through the tables with a heavy feeling in her legs. The sparkle of the room had lost its luster hours ago. Now, under the harsh glare of the chandeliers, the room just looked like a lot of tired people in expensive clothes trying too hard. She was collecting the final round of coffee cups, moving quietly so she wouldn't disturb the dull hum of the crowd. In the far corner of the room, the jazz trio was finishing their set. They were talented musicians, hired to play smooth, safe music that wouldn't distract anyone from talking. They played with the kind of skill that blends perfectly into the background. As the last note of their song faded away, the pianist stood up. He was a middle-aged man with gray hair and a look of relief on his face. He packed his sheet music into a bag, snapped the lid shut, and walked off the stage without looking back. Suddenly, the room felt very different. Without the music to fill the gaps, the atmosphere changed instantly. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was heavy and awkward. Now, every noise seemed amplified. The clinking of a spoon against a saucer sounded like a gong. The scrape of a chair against the marble floor made people flinch. A woman's high-pitched laugh from the back of the room echoed in a way that sounded jarring rather than joyful. The guests began to notice the silence, and they didn't like it. The lack of background music made the room feel dead. It forced them to hear their own voices, and maybe they didn't like what they were saying to each other. The murmuring in the room grew louder as people tried to talk over the emptiness, creating a low, anxious rumble. The waitress watched this happen from the service station. She saw the frowns on people's faces. She saw them checking their watches, looking bored and uncomfortable. It was amazing to her how much they relied on the music to feel comfortable. They didn't care about the art, but they needed the noise. Then, the commotion started near the front entrance. The event manager, a man who was always running around with a clipboard and a look of panic on his face, was pacing back and forth. He was on his phone, talking fast and sweating. From her spot across the room, the waitress could hear bits and pieces of his shouting. "What do you mean you're stuck?" he hissed into the phone, trying to keep his voice down but failing. "There are 500 people here. I don't care about the traffic. You said you'd be here by 10. He hung up the phone and slammed it against his palm. He looked around the ballroom, his eyes wide. He looked like a man who was realizing the ship was sinking and he didn't have a lifeboat. The intermission act, a string quartet that was supposed to play while the band took a break, wasn't coming. They were stuck miles away in the city traffic. The manager started pacing again, looking at his watch, then at the empty stage, then at the crowd. The guests were getting restless. A man at a nearby table waved the manager over and complained loudly about the dead atmosphere. The manager nodded, wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, and apologized repeatedly. The waitress felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew what this meant. She knew how the manager worked when he was stressed. He looked for the quickest, easiest solution, no matter how messy it was. He didn't care about quality, he just wanted to stop the complaining. She turned her back to the room, pretending to organize some napkins, hoping that if she didn't look at him, he wouldn't think of her. But it was no use. The manager's eyes scanned the room, looking for staff. They skipped over the waiters carrying heavy trays. They skipped over the bartenders who were busy mixing drinks. His eyes landed on her. She was the only one who wasn't carrying anything. She was the only one who looked like she had nothing to do. He marched across the room, pushing past guests without apologizing, heading straight for the service station. The waitress saw him coming out of the corner of her eye, and her heart rate picked up. She kept her head down, focusing on a stack of coasters, arranging them into a perfect square. "You," the manager said, breathless, stopping right in front of her. She looked up slowly. "Yes, sir. The pianist is gone. The quartet is stuck in traffic," he said, speaking fast and waving his hands around. "The guests are going crazy. It's too quiet. People are leaving. I need music. Now." The waitress looked past him, toward the grand piano sitting alone on the small platform. It looked huge and imposing from this distance. I don't think the bartender can leave," she stammered, trying to dodge the request. "The bar is very busy." "Not the bartender. You," he snapped, pointing a finger at her chest. "I remember your application. You played music before. You checked the box that said you could play piano." "That was just a box," she said quietly, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. "I play a little, but not like this. These people, they expect something professional." "I don't need a concert," he growled, losing his patience. "I need noise. I need atmosphere. Just go up there and play something. Play scales. Play nursery rhymes. I don't care. Just fill the silence before my boss comes out here and fires me." He didn't ask her if she wanted to. He didn't ask if she was comfortable. It was an order, just like fetching water or clearing a table. "Go," he commanded, turning her around by the shoulder and giving her a gentle shove toward the floor. "Make yourself useful. And for heaven's sake, take that apron off. You look like a mess." The waitress stood frozen for a moment. The other staff members nearby stopped what they were doing to watch. She could feel their eyes on her. Some looked sympathetic, others looked relieved it wasn't them. She untied the strings of her black apron and pulled it off, folding it neatly and placing it on the counter. Underneath, she wore a simple white button-down shirt and a long black skirt. It was the closest thing she had to formal wear. She smoothed the fabric with her shaking hands. "Just play scales," she whispered to herself, trying to calm the storm in her chest. "Just make noise." She took a deep breath and walked out of the service station. It felt like the longest walk of her life. As she moved through the tables, nobody noticed her at first. She was just another employee moving across the floor. But then, the path cleared. She wasn't carrying a tray. She wasn't holding a bin. She was walking with a purpose that didn't involve serving anyone. The guests closest to the aisle watched her pass. They saw her simple clothes, her worn shoes, and her nervous expression. They saw her walking toward the instrument that had been silent all night. A few people whispered to each other, probably wondering what was going on. She reached the small stage and stepped up onto the platform. The piano was even more beautiful up close. It was a shiny black beast, looming over her. The bench was pulled out slightly, waiting for someone. She sat down. The bench felt hard and unfamiliar. The room was still noisy. People were still talking, laughing, and drinking. They had no idea what was about to happen. They didn't know that the woman who had poured their water and picked up their dirty napkins was sitting at the keys. To them, She was just a temporary fix, a human bandage to stop the bleeding of a boring party. The manager stood near the edge of the stage, his arms crossed over his chest, glaring at her as if to say, "Don't embarrass me." The waitress placed her hands on her knees. She looked out at the sea of faces. Most of them were turned away, ignoring her. They were rich, powerful, and completely unaware. They saw only a waitress. They saw nothing special. She lifted her hands and placed them on the keys. The ivory was cool and smooth under her fingertips. Her calluses fit perfectly against the edges of the white keys. It felt like coming home after being away for 100 years. The manager gave her a sharp nod. "Play," he mouthed silently. She closed her eyes. She blocked out the lights, the noise, the manager, and the guests. She forgot about the rent, the sickness, and the long shifts. For the first time in years, she let her mind go quiet. She didn't play scales. She didn't play a nursery rhyme. She took a breath, and then, her hands began to move. The moment her fingers touched the keys, the air in the room seemed to shift. It wasn't a sudden boom or a loud crash that caught everyone's attention. It was the opposite. It was a deep, resonant vibration that started in the belly of the grand piano and spread outward like a ripple in a pond. The very first chord she struck was a C minor, but it wasn't played politely. It was played with a weight that seemed to press down on the room, silencing the clatter of silverware and the hum of conversation instantly. She didn't start with a fast tune to show off her speed. She started with a slow, mournful melody that crawled into the ears of the guests and demanded their attention. It was a sound so rich and full that it felt like a voice singing without words. The piano, which had sat silent and cold all night, suddenly seemed to come alive, groaning and purring under her hands. The waitress sat up straighter. Her posture changed completely. Just moments ago, she had been a shadowy figure, shrinking into her uniform, trying to take up as little space as possible. Now, her shoulders went back, her neck elongated, and her hands took on a life of their own. They weren't the hands of a servant anymore, they were the hands of a master, sculpting the air. At the tables closest to the stage, the chatter began to die down. A man in a gray suit was in the middle of telling a loud story about a business deal, his mouth open to make a punchline. As the music swelled, his voice trailed off. He found himself listening to the notes instead of speaking. The sound was cutting through the thick layer of smoke and expensive perfume, reaching something deep inside him that he forgot he had. Across the room, a woman in a glittering gown was looking into a small mirror, fixing her lipstick. She stopped moving. The hand holding the mirror froze in mid-air. The melody coming from the piano was sad and beautiful, reminding her of a memory she hadn't thought of in years, a summer evening from her childhood, the feeling of the wind, the smell of rain. She lowered the mirror, her eyes staring blankly at the tablecloth, completely captured by the music. The manager stood near the side of the stage, his arms still crossed over his chest, but his eyes were wide. He had expected her to play chopsticks or a simple folk song. He had expected her to be nervous, to make mistakes, to provide a little bit of background noise so the guests wouldn't complain about the silence. But this was not background noise. This was a tidal wave. The music began to pick up speed. Her left hand started to walk up the lower registers, playing a steady, heartbeat rhythm that thumped against the floorboards. Her right hand danced over the high notes, weaving a complex, lace-like pattern that was dizzying and fast. It wasn't jazz, and it wasn't classical. It was something entirely her own. It was raw and messy, full of sharp turns and sudden stops, yet it held together perfectly. The guests were turning in their chairs now. It was a slow, synchronized movement, like sunflowers turning toward the sun. One by one, they stopped looking at their plates and their phones. They stopped looking at each other. They all looked at the stage. And there, for the first time all night, they really saw her. They saw the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way she bit her lip slightly when the music got difficult. They saw the sweat forming on her forehead, not from carrying heavy trays, but from the sheer intensity of her focus. They saw the passion in her movements. When she played a loud, crashing chord, she leaned her whole body into it, putting every ounce of her strength into the sound. When she played a soft, delicate whisper of a note, she gently caressed the key as if it were a baby bird. It was a performance that demanded respect. It was the kind of music that you couldn't ignore. It grabbed the rich and powerful people by their collars and forced them to listen. A young man near the front, who had been busy taking photos of his dinner for the internet, lowered his phone. He watched the waitress's fingers fly across the keys. They were a blur. He had never seen anyone move that fast. He realized, with a sudden shock, that this woman he had ignored earlier when she asked if he wanted water possessed a talent that money could not buy. He could buy the ticket to the event, he could buy the suit he was wearing, he could buy the dinner on the table, but he could never buy the ability to play like that. The mood in the ballroom had completely transformed. The arrogance, the greed, and the vanity that had filled the room just 10 minutes ago were gone. In their place was a sense of awe. The music was stripping away the layers of social status. For a few minutes, everyone in the room was equal. They were all just listeners, united by the sound of the piano. The waitress didn't notice any of this. Her eyes were closed, tight shut. In her mind, she was far away from the hotel. She wasn't sitting on a hard bench in a ballroom. She was back in her childhood home, sitting at an old, worn-out piano. She was playing for her father, who used to sit in the armchair and listen with a smile on his face. She remembered how he used to tell her that her music was magic, that it could heal wounds and calm storms. She poured all those memories into the keys. She played her longing, her exhaustion, and her hidden hopes. She played the years of silence she had endured. Every note was a word she hadn't been allowed to speak. Every chord was a scream she had held in while cleaning up spilled wine and listening to people talk about things that didn't matter. The music grew louder, filling every corner of the massive hall. The chandeliers overhead seemed to shimmer in time with the vibrations. The heavy curtains that lined the walls absorbed the sound, but the music was too strong to be hidden. There was a moment in the middle of the piece where the music dropped out completely. The waitress let her hands hover over the keys for 2, 3, 4 seconds of absolute silence. The room held its breath. No one moved. No one coughed. It was so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerators in the kitchen. It was a tense, electric silence. Then, she brought her hands down. A cascade of thundering notes poured out of the piano, tumbling over each other like a waterfall. It was a sound of triumph, of breaking free. The volume grew and grew, echoing off the high ceilings, shaking the glasses on the tables. It was a sound that said, "I am here. I am somebody. See me." The physical effort was immense. Her arms burned with the effort of controlling the loud volume, her fingers stretching to hit notes far apart. But she didn't stop. She was running on pure emotion now. She was running on the memory of every yes sir and right away she had ever whispered. This was her answer to all of it. At the table where the rude man sat, his jaw was literally hanging open. He had forgotten all about his cold water. He was staring at the woman's back, watching the way her muscles moved under her plain white shirt. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, a feeling of smallness. He realized that for all his money and influence, he had never created anything as beautiful as the sound coming from that stage. He had spent his entire life acquiring things, but this woman had something inside her that she couldn't acquire. She was born with it. Or maybe she had earned it through years of struggle. He didn't know which, but he knew he was in the presence of greatness. The music began to slow down. The racing notes calmed down. The thunder softened into a gentle rain. She brought the melody back to the deep, sad notes she had started with, closing the circle. It felt like the end of a long journey. She played the final few chords with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of some of the guests. They were simple chords, played softly, but the emotion behind them was overwhelming. She struck the very last note, a single, low, resonant sound. She held her finger on the key, letting the vibration sustain, letting it fade slowly, 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 until there was nothing left but the memory of the sound. She lifted her hands off the keyboard and rested them on her lap. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a full silence. It was heavy and sacred. The waitress sat there for a moment, her chest heaving slightly, her eyes still closed. She was coming back to reality, leaving the world of music and returning to the world of the Chandelier Hotel. She waited for the spell to break. She waited for someone to drop a glass, for the manager to yell, for the noise of life to rush back in and wash her away again. The silence that followed the last note was not like the silence before. Earlier, the room had been quiet because of awkwardness and the lack of noise. Now, the room was quiet because of respect. It was a heavy, thick silence that pressed against the walls, demanding that no one break it. It felt as if the air itself had changed, charged with the electricity of what had just happened. For perhaps the first time in the history of this hotel, nobody was checking their watch, nobody was whispering about a stock market crash or a new yacht. 500 people held their breath at the exact same time. The young woman sat on the bench, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She was slowly coming back to the present moment. In her mind, she was still floating in the melody, but her body was beginning to feel the hardwood of the bench and the cool air of the ballroom. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, not from fear this time, but from the sheer force of pouring her soul out into the room. She kept her eyes closed for a moment longer, afraid to open them. She knew that once she opened her eyes, the magic would break, and she would just be a waitress in a white shirt again. Then, a sound cut through the quiet. It wasn't a cough. It wasn't a glass clinking. It was the sound of a man standing up from his chair. The screech of the wooden legs against the marble floor was startlingly loud. The waitress flinched slightly, her eyes snapping open. She braced herself. She expected to see the manager coming to scold her for playing too long, or an angry guest complaining about the volume. But when she looked out at the sea of tables, she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. It was the man in the gray suit, the one who had been bragging loudly earlier. He was standing at his table near the front. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't looking at his friends. He was looking right at her. And he was clapping. He started slowly, his hands meeting together with a deliberate, heavy beat. Clap. 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 Usually, in this room, applause was polite. It was a light sound, something people did while they were already looking around to see who else was leaving. But this was different. This man was clapping like he meant it. He was clapping as if his life depended on it. Almost immediately, a woman at the next table stood up. She was the one in the glittering gown who had been fixing her lipstick. She had tears running down her cheeks, smudging her perfectly applied makeup. She didn't wipe them away. She just looked at the stage with a mixture of sorrow and joy, and she joined in the clapping. Then, like a wave crashing over the shore, the rest of the room began to move. First one person, then two, then 10. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet. The sound started as a scattered rhythm and quickly grew into a deafening roar. It wasn't just applause, it was a thunderstorm of hands. It filled the massive space, bouncing off the high ceilings and shaking the crystal chandeliers. It was louder than the jazz band had been, louder than the traffic outside, louder than anything the waitress had ever heard. She sat frozen on the bench, her hands gripping the edge of the piano seat. Her face went pale. She looked left and right, as if there was someone else on the stage they could possibly be cheering for. But there was no one else. It was just her and the piano. The change in the room was absolute. The invisible wall that had separated the important guests from the staff had been shattered by the music. They weren't seeing a servant anymore. They weren't seeing a uniform. They were seeing the artist who had just touched their hearts. They were realizing that the woman who had poured their water and cleared their dirty plates possessed a talent that money could not buy. The manager stood near the edge of the stage, his mouth hanging open. He looked from the cheering crowd to the woman on the bench, completely dumbfounded. He had been ready to drag her off the stage 5 minutes ago. Now, he looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. He slowly lowered his clipboard, realizing he had made a terrible mistake by not seeing what was right in front of him. The people in the front row were leaning forward, their faces glowing with admiration. The rude man who had complained about his water was now clapping the hardest. He looked ashamed. He had treated this woman like a piece of furniture, and now she had shown him that she was more of a man than he was, in a way that mattered. He understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that true class comes from how you treat others, and that genius is often found in the places you least expect to look. The young woman trembled as the sound washed over her. She felt exposed. For years, she had hidden her talent, burying it deep under layers of routine and hard work. She had used her job as a shield, letting her uniform make her invisible so she could survive in a world that didn't have time for her dreams. Now, the shield was gone. They had seen her. They had really seen her. And strangely, they didn't look angry. They didn't look bored. They looked humbled. A young waiter stood near the back wall, holding a tray of empty glasses. He was watching his co-worker with a look of pure pride on his face. He saw how the guests were looking at her not as a servant, but as a star. He knew how hard she worked, and he knew how many nights she had gone home to an empty apartment. Seeing this moment felt like justice. It felt like the universe was finally balancing the scales. The applause went on and on. It lasted for so long that the woman began to feel uncomfortable. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. She was used to blending in, to being the background noise in other people's lives. This level of focus was terrifying. She tried to catch the manager's eye to signal that she should leave, but he was still staring at the crowd, lost in the spectacle. So, she looked back at the audience. She saw the tears, the smiles, and the awe. She saw people who were genuinely moved. It was a strange feeling to realize that her pain, her struggle, and her hidden dreams were the very things that connected them to her. She took a deep, shaky breath and slowly stood up. The sound of the bench sliding on the stage floor was lost in the roar of the crowd, but the movement caused a hush to fall over them again. The clapping didn't stop, but it softened slightly as people leaned in to see what she would do. She didn't bow like a famous performer. She didn't raise her hands in victory. She just stood there, looking small in front of the massive black piano. She smoothed her skirt nervously, a gesture of habit that reminded everyone she was still the same person. Then, she gave a small, shy nod. It was a simple gesture of acknowledgement. A thank you to the room for listening. The man in the gray suit smiled and nodded back at her, a look of genuine respect on his face. The woman in the gown wiped her eyes and blew a kiss toward the stage. The young woman turned her head slightly, looking toward the service door where the kitchen was. She knew she couldn't stay up here forever. The spell had to break eventually. The night would end, the guests would go home, and she would still have to pay her rent. But for this one moment, the world had turned upside down. The girl who served the rich and famous had captivated them completely. The invisible woman had finally been seen, and she was beautiful. The young woman stood quietly for a moment, letting the last echoes of the applause wash over her like a warm wave. It was a sound she had never heard directed at her before, loud, pure, and full of a kind of admiration she usually only saw given to movie stars or famous athletes. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it thumping against her ribs, a frantic drum solo in her chest. But underneath the shock, she felt a strange sense of peace. She had done it. She had let the music out, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, for a few minutes, the world had actually stopped to listen. She knew she couldn't stay on the stage forever. The longer she stood there, the more the magic would fade into awkwardness. This wasn't a concert hall where she was supposed to take a bow and come back for an encore. This was a hotel ballroom, and she was still just an employee. She had to go back to work. With a shy, almost awkward movement, she gave the crowd one last small nod. It wasn't a bow of submission, it was a nod of equality. She was acknowledging that they had listened, and that she had heard them listening. Then, she turned away from the piano. As she walked toward the side of the stage, the crowd began to sit down, but their eyes followed her every step. The atmosphere in the room was completely different now. The air felt lighter, the artificial barriers between the people seemed to have dissolved. The heavy sense of judgment that usually hung over these expensive parties was gone. In its place was a feeling of shared humanity. They had all been touched by the same melody, felt the same sadness, and experienced the same joy. She stepped off the wooden platform and her feet touched the marble floor. Instantly, the sensation of reality came rushing back. The floor was hard, the air smelled of food and perfume again, and her legs felt tired, but something inside her had changed. She stood a little taller now. Her shoulders weren't slumped forward under the weight of an imaginary burden. She walked with her head up. The manager was still standing near the curtains, looking like he had just seen a ghost. As she approached him, his eyes were wide, darting from her face to the piano and back to the crowd. He opened his mouth to speak, closed it, and then opened it again. For once, he didn't have a clipboard to hide behind. He looked small. I. He stammered, his face turning a shade of red that clashed with his tie. The waitress looked at him calmly. She didn't look down at her shoes like she usually did. She looked him right in the eye. It was a simple look, but it carried the weight of what she had just done. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence spoke louder than words. It said, "You see me now." The manager swallowed hard, straightening his jacket. He seemed to realize that scolding her now would make him look like a fool in front of the guests. He cleared his throat, his voice raspy. That was acceptable, he mumbled, trying to hold on to his authority, but failing miserably. The guests seem happy. You can go back to the floor now. Thank you, she said softly. Her voice was steady, not the whisper of a scared servant. She didn't wait for him to change his mind. She turned and walked toward the service station to retrieve her apron. As she passed through the crowd, an amazing thing happened. The guests didn't turn away. They didn't ignore her. People actually shifted in their chairs to make room for her to pass. A man in a very expensive tuxedo, who had earlier snapped his fingers at her for water, watched her walk by. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her with a face full of wonder and, perhaps, a little bit of shame. He slowly reached out and pulled his chair in closer to the table, clearing the path for her as a sign of respect. It was a small movement, but in this world of ego, it was a massive admission. The young woman walked behind the large fake plant and picked up her black apron. She tied the strings around her waist, covering her simple white shirt. As she covered herself up, it felt like putting on a costume again, but the illusion had been broken. They knew what was under the uniform now. They knew the uniform didn't define her. She picked up a silver tray and turned back toward the room. Usually, when she went out to clear tables, she felt invisible, like a ghost moving through a crowd of living people. Tonight, she felt like a spotlight was following her, but it wasn't a harsh light. It was a warm glow. She went to a table where a couple sat in silence. They had been arguing earlier, their faces angry and tight. Now, they were holding hands across the table, looking at each other with soft expressions. The music had smoothed out their rough edges. The waitress stepped up to the table. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked gently. The woman looked up. Her eyes were wet, as if she had been crying, but she was smiling. She looked at the waitress's face, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time all night. "Yes, please," the woman said, her voice kind. "And, thank you. That was beautiful." The waitress paused, a tray resting on her arm. "Thank you for listening," she replied. It was a genuine moment of connection between two strangers. In the past, this woman would have looked right through her, treating her like a machine that brought coffee. Now, she saw a person with a soul. She moved through the room, clearing plates and pouring coffee. Everywhere she went, the energy had shifted. The noise level in the room was lower, but the feeling was deeper. People were talking, but they weren't bragging. They were speaking softer, leaning in to listen to each other. The harsh, competitive edge of the party was gone. The music had acted like a key, unlocking a door to their emotions that they usually kept locked tight. At the back of the room, the other wait staff watched her with wide eyes. They stood a little straighter too, proud of one of their own. The hierarchy of the hotel, where the managers were kings and the staff were peasants, felt less rigid tonight. If she could do that, who knew what they were capable of? The event eventually wound down. The guests began to gather their coats and say their goodbyes. As they left, many of them stopped by the service station on their way out. They didn't ask for the manager to complain. They wanted to find her. They didn't offer her recording contracts or $1 million tips, those things only happen in movies. They offered her something simpler, but perhaps more valuable. They offered her their respect. "Play for us again soon," said an older man, patting her shoulder gently. "You have a gift," said a younger woman, squeezing her hand. "Don't give up on the music," whispered another. These words stuck to her heart like honey. They were the validation she had been starving for. She realized that her music didn't need a fancy concert hall or a famous conductor. It just needed to be heard. It had the power to change a room, to touch the lives of people who thought they had everything. Finally, the last guest left. The big glass doors of the ballroom were closed, shutting out the noise of the night. The cleanup crew began to move the chairs and flip the tablecloths. The spell was broken, the magic returned to the box. The manager walked by, looking exhausted. He stopped near her. "Good job tonight," he muttered, not looking at her. "We might need you to play at the gala next month. If we're short on the budget again." She almost laughed. He still thought it was about the budget. He still thought she was just a tool to fill the silence. He didn't understand that she was the one who had brought the silence to life. "We'll see," she said simply. She wasn't sure if she would play for them again. She knew her worth now. She untied her apron and hung it up for the last time that night. She walked out of the ballroom, through the long, empty corridors of the hotel, and pushed open the heavy side exit door. The cool night air hit her face. It was fresh and clean. She looked up at the sky. The city lights were glowing, and the stars were dim, but everything looked different to her. She walked toward the bus stop, her feet still sore, her pockets still empty of extra money, but her heart was full. She touched her fingertips together, remembering the feel of the keys. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a musician. And tomorrow, when she woke up, she would still have to work hard to survive. But she would know, deep down, that she had something the rich and famous couldn't buy. She had a voice, and she had made the world listen. She smiled to herself, a real, genuine smile, as the bus pulled up to the curb, ready to take her home.